good? We good? Hello? Ah, okay. Chris. Hello everybody, thank you very, very much for coming to our Agile IBM meetup this evening. I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to be able to introduce Esther Darby, who's going to be speaking to us this evening. So Esther is an expert in how to achieve environments where great, amazing work emerges and where that's a satisfying and enriching experience for the people in their teams. So she's done this through an extensive amount of Agile experience and coaching through her career. In fact, she's reached the dizzy heights of being one of the 37 people in Agile top trumps. So, and I just showed her the card. She's like, I've not seen these. So here's Esther in top trumps. Actually, it's not a bad card to play, actually. So well done, Esther, you've made it. Yeah, you have to top trump other Agile people. Oh, we'll see. We'll play later. So she's gone from Agile, and as her career has progressed and her experience has grown, she now spends a huge amount of time actually helping VPs and C-suite transform their organizations. So you can imagine when Esther offered to us to come and talk about how she's distilled her experience into 6 rules for change, we were like, yes, please, Esther. So I will stop talking, and I will hand you over to Esther to share the jewels of her experience. Thanks, Esther.
So that was a very lovely introduction. Jewels. So I'll tell you a little bit more about me. I actually started my career as a programmer. Any other programmers in the room? Yes, a few. Yes, the few, the mighty, the proud. If I told you what language I started with, you'd know when I started as a programmer. Any guesses what my favorite language is? Assembler. Yes. Pardon? Oh. I understand that there are still job openings for this in the insurance companies where people are retiring and they still have these legacy applications in assembler. So I suppose I could get a job if I wanted to. Anyway, that's how I started as a programmer, and over the years I've done a lot of different things. I did testing, I was a team lead, I was a dev manager, I was a consultant at an internal consultant at a big US company. It wasn't IBM, it was a different big US company. And what was clear to me from all of those perspectives is that our work environment has a huge impact on our ability to be successful. You can take a really smart person, and if you put them in a crappy system, I'm quoting a professor, so I can say that, if you put them in a crappy system, you know, the best they can do is not their best. So I really focus my attention on the environments we create for people. And that almost always involves change. Almost always involves change. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, how companies approach change. And I realize my next slide actually has to do with the change I made. This is where I live, where that red dot is. I moved there 4 years ago because my husband thought Minneapolis, which is the next big city south, was too hot. So, I mean, that was a recent change I went through. I live there because I can, and I own a lot of wool. So, change. It was a change for me. One that I chose. I willingly chose to move to Duluth. But for many of us, we don't get much choice about change because of the way change is often thought about in organizations. So for many of us, change is this inexplicable thing that drops through the ceiling of some corporate elysium and lands on our heads. Has that ever happened to anyone in this room? Yeah, it just drops through the ceiling. We don't know why, we don't know. We just know it came from the corporate elysium, and here it is dropping on our heads. And it creates a certain set of problems. The other way that people talk about change a lot They use metaphors for change. They talk about driving change. Anybody hear people talk about driving change? So what comes to mind when you think about driving change?
Whip in a chair.
Yeah. Well, I think of driving herds of cattle. Right? You're driving the cattle before you. There's a chair, whip, whatever. Or driving down a road, which is smooth and paved, and you have the triptych that tells you where to go, or your GPS, and you just follow nicely. It makes it sound easy. Just drop the change through a hole in the ceiling. Just drive it. Just drive down the road. Or install it. Just like it's a new part of a machine. It's just like plug and play, right? Or you implement it, just like you pass a law, and suddenly it's different. Does this match what you hear about change? Does it match the reality of change? Yeah. So I think these ways of talking about change actually make change much, much more difficult. Much more difficult. There's another thing that sometimes gets in our way. How many of you have the term Agile evangelist in your title? Anybody have that title? Agile evangelist. You know what happens to evangelists? This is what happens to evangelists. And really, it's not terribly surprising because, you know, who wants to be told they've been living in darkness? No one wants to be told they've been living in darkness. And I'm here to bring you the Agile light. You have been living in the waterfall darkness, and here is the Agile light. Nobody wants to hear that. Waterfall actually works sometimes. Worked great for Y2K. Can't think of too many other things. But if the requirements are knowable up front, yeah, that's fine. So nobody really wants to know they've been living in the darkness. You know, it just doesn't work out so well. So I tend to stay away from this sort of language, and I tend to stay away from this sort of idea of change, and think instead about nurturing change in complex environments. So that's really what we have to do, is we need to nurture it. We can't just install it. We can't drive it. We can't, you know, coax people out of the darkness. We really need to nurture it. So I have, through my work, changing systems and helping humans within systems change, come up with these 6 rules. And there's 6 of them, and they each have a number, but that doesn't mean they necessarily go in a particular order. These are just principles that you need to keep in mind when you're making change. So, the first one is work from a place of congruence, balancing the interests of self, other, and context. What does that mean? It means that we recognize that people are not doing something because they are stupid, bad, and wrong. They are doing something because it was the best choice that was open to them at a time, or it is what the previous manager told them to do, right? So this is not a static place. This is a dynamic stance of balance. So I always think about a wobble board. Anybody use a wobble board at the gym? Yeah, it challenges your balance. And you always have to be making little micro adjustments, you know, so that you stay in balance. It's really important because this is the place from which you can access your best thinking, your best problem solving, and it's the only place you can access empathy. It's the only place from which you can access empathy. And empathy is super important for understanding why people might be responding the way they are responding to whatever change it is that you think will help improve the situation. Right, so people get sometimes, I think, confused about empathy because they think it means you have to feel someone else's feelings and then fix it for them. And that's not actually what's involved in empathy. There are different kinds of empathy. We tend to think about emotional empathy, which is important. You know, understanding where people are coming from in terms of how they're experiencing a change is important. I once heard a manager say to someone who was very concerned about the level of stress people were experiencing during a change, and was trying to get some relief for people who were actually at the point of getting sick because they were so stressed about this change. He said, "I've thought about it, you don't need to feel that way." Well, that's not empathy of any sort, but it's clearly not emotional empathy. So acknowledging that someone's feelings are legitimate and sitting with it, that's important in change, because change almost always involves some sense of loss. Loss of a sense of competence, loss of a sense of routine, very often loss of relationships. So you need to be able to sit with that with people. But you also need to have cognitive empathy, which is, I understand how someone else thinks. Right? So you're coming from a traditional background, traditional project management role. Which do you think will work better? Telling them they've been living in darkness, or saying, I understand why it seems that way. You know, I understand why that's a concern for you. You know, because, you know, risk in projects is important. There's actually a really great book called, I'm a little jet lagged, let's see if I remember, A Project Manager's Bridge to Agility. I think that's, anybody heard of that book? It's, if you work with people who are in a traditional project management role, it's a great book because it totally has cognitive empathy for where they're coming from. And it maps everything. There's how we would do the same thing, address the same concern in an agile way. So that's cognitive empathy. Point of view empathy says, I can see how it looks from where you are sitting in the organization, because where you sit in an organization influences where you stand on a change, whether you think it's a brilliant idea or someone's incomprehensible surprise. Right? So point of view empathy matters. And sometimes empathy is actually an action. So I was at a conference in Warsaw not too long ago, and I was really jet lagged, and I was out at dinner with a group of people, and they served soup. This may not seem terribly surprising or difficult, but when you're jet lagged and you have a hand tremor, there is no way the soup will get from the bowl to your mouth in a spoon. Right? So I picked up my spoon, and it was clear that it was not going to work. And this lovely young woman sitting at the table, lovely in terms that she was just a really great person from my point of view, sat there and stirred her soup for a little while, and then she put her spoon down and she picked up her bowl. And then the person across from her stirred her soup, picked up her bowl. It gave me complete cover to pick up my bowl. And I thought that was a really fascinating example of empathy in action, right? Nobody said, oh, it must feel bad to have a tremor, or, oh, I can see why that's hard. It was just picked up the bowl of soup. And I picked up my bowl of soup, and it was really good. But so empathy takes many forms, and it's a super important thing to think about in change. One of my rules of thumb is I try to think of 5 reasons that a smart, intelligent person would not be interested in making the change that I am involved with. You know, why would someone not want to do this? What are 5 possible legitimate reasons? And that helps me have empathy for them and for their point of view. And it often gives me a lot of additional ideas about what I could do that would move things forward. And the fact that I have listened to them makes them want to listen to me. So it works on many levels. You will come back to this idea of congruence many, many times during a change. Because there will be frustrations, there will be annoyances, there will be times when you feel a little defeated. So you come back and you rebalance and think of, what are my needs? What are the needs of the other people? What's the need of the context? Always come back to this. The second rule is honor what is valuable about the past and what is working now. Don't make people wrong. Nobody likes to be told they're wrong. They're doing something that made sense at one point. They're doing something that maybe is what the last person directed them to do. And when you think about it, being right and wrong are actually the same feeling state. Nobody comes into work and says, I'm going to do the wrongest thing I can think of today. So the people who are doing something that may seem wrong, they feel the same as you do, like they're doing a reasonable thing. No one comes into work saying, I'm going to do something wrong or do something unreasonable. But when you tell people that they're wrong, what do you think happens? What happens when someone tells you you're wrong? You get a little defensive. Most people do. Not everybody, but it's a very common response. And people don't really like to hear that what they've been doing is wasteful or irrelevant or they're a dinosaur. This can actually touch very deeply on people's sense of self. Right? So has anyone seen the movie Hidden Figures? Yeah, it's a really interesting movie about women who worked for NASA and did the calculations for the space shuttle. Before them, there were women who did ballistic calculations. And actually a lot of the calculations that were done during the Second World War, the ballistic calculations were done by women. And they had an important job, a very meaningful job. And with the advent of computers, their job went away, right? So that was a loss of meaning in their lives. And most of them weathered it and moved on, but not all of them. Some of them didn't survive that loss. So when we're bringing some bright new thing, you know, that's part of what we have to be empathetic to and what we have to honor, is that it can be a loss for people, that they're doing something that made sense and was extremely valuable at one time, and their knowledge is very likely important and useful some other place. Rule number 3. Observe the current state. The current situation and the current state. So I apologize to those of you who've already heard this story once today, but I'm going to tell it again. You know which story I'm going to tell, right? So I think it's crucially important to really observe what is, so that you have a good idea about what action you can take that will move the situation in a better direction. All right, so we're not talking about rolling out some big change here. We're talking about, this is a situation where we want to move in this direction. What is the first best thing I can do to move it in that direction? So where I grew up, when I was a kid, there was this children's party game called Pin the Tail on the Donkey. Anybody, you guys know about that? Yeah, so it's a really horrible game where there's a picture of a very, very sad looking donkey with his tail missing. And the object of the game is to pin the tail back on the donkey in the correct place. So you recognize this game? Yeah. Except the party mother puts a blindfold on you and spins you around till you're dizzy, and you stumble around trying to pin the tail on it. It ends up on, you know, on its head, on its eye, on the wall, someplace else. You don't want to be that kid when you're making a change. Right? You don't want to be that kid stumbling around with a blindfold on, trying to figure out what to do. So you need to really observe the current system, understand what's working now, and as importantly, understand what holds the current pattern in place. This is almost universally overlooked in making a change, and big changes in organizations. So one of the common examples I see is someone will come in and say, we're going agile. Going agile. We're going to have teams. We want teamwork. But people still have very narrowly focused job descriptions, and they still are rewarded and ranked as individuals. All right. That holds the current pattern in place. You know, if you have people who are doing individual task work and you want collaboration, those are some things that hold the pattern of individuation in place. Right? So you need to look for those, because sometimes softening those makes the change very, very easy. Right? Makes it very easy if you can figure out what holds the current pattern in place. Right? You know, our dev managers turn things over to test and then somehow the project gets late. That ever happen around here? Anybody ever lived through that? Yeah. Well, that's a system that rewards dev managers for meeting a date, and then test managers can take care of the rest of it. Right? That holds that pattern in place. So you need to look at those and see what you can shift. You can't always shift everything. One company I worked with wanted people to work in a more cross-functional way, and making any change to their job descriptions required the approval of, I think it was 32 vice presidents. So we didn't go that route. We found a way to contextualize them for the managers so that they could figure out how to advocate for their folks when it got to the ranking. You know, it wasn't ideal, but it helped us move a little bit in the direction, soften that a little bit. You need to understand what people understand and what they need to learn. Because we've all grown up with a certain legacy that leads us to think about things in certain ways. And sometimes we need to learn new ways. We need to learn new ways of thinking about things. One of the reasons I'm here this week is I'm working with some of the coaches at IBM about thinking about coaching a different way. Because we often think about, oh, coaching is a one-on-one individual thing. But if you're working with a team, one of your biggest areas to have an impact is actually looking at the environment around the team, right? So if you want to move towards more teamwork or collaboration, that's one of the things you might need to learn, is how do we create environments for teams? Because it's not just picking 5 people and putting them in a room together, right? There's a lot more to it. So what needs to be learned? You need to know who's benefiting from the way things are and who stands to lose. You might be able to find people another place of value. You might be able to deal with some of the losses they might experience. One of the things I think has not helped Agile at all is talking, in the early days people used to say, we don't need no stinking managers. Well, what do you think the managers did then? I don't think they said, oh, okay, fine, I'm obsolete. I'll just go crawl into my hole somewhere. You know, I mean, you need to find a place where they can be valuable. And I actually think that there is a far more strategic role for managers in Agile than there is in task management, right? There's a far more strategic role in looking at how the system is functioning. Figure out who will work with you. I think a lot of people spend energy trying to convince people who are reluctant. When it's actually much more helpful to figure out who will work with you and use their energy. And they'll find 10 people, and they'll find 10 people. And pretty soon you'll have critical mass, right? You can actually start making a significant change that way. I also think it's important to work from where you are. You know, it is true that the functioning of a system is the way the parts interact as much as it is anything else, but sometimes the only thing you can work on when you start is one part. So that's where you start, and you work there. And you learn something, and you gain some momentum, and you move from there. There's no perfect place to start. And what is possible with the passage of time is not evident from where you stand now. Right? This is one of the legacies of sort of deterministic thinking, which is that we can plan a change all the way out into the future. And particularly when we're talking about Agile, or we're talking about making more significant organizational changes, you can't see what's possible from where you stand now. Right? You might be able to see the horizon, but you can't tell what the territory is in between and what obstacles you'll come across, or what might be possible once you get there. So assess the current situation, look for what's holding the pattern in place, and be willing to start wherever you can, and then find new possibilities. Rule number 4, pay attention to networks. Relying on the formal hierarchy cuts off a very, very important avenue of communication and a very, very important avenue of influence in organizations. Is anybody in this room a smoker? Do you have any smokers? Well, okay, just a few people raised their hands. In the US, I bet it's the same way here. Smokers congregate outside to smoke. Is that true? Can't smoke in the building, they congregate outside? I would say that in most of the organizations I go into, the smokers are about the best informed people around. Because they are talking to people all across the hierarchy and across various parts of the organization and divisions of the organization all the time. They know what's going on, often far more than the hierarchy does. Now, I'm not advocating you take up smoking. I'm really not. I'm a reformed smoker, and we're the worst. You know, we're the worst when it comes to being anti-smoking. But smokers know a lot. We can take from that principle of network and apply it to change. It's really interesting to notice who is trusted for advice in a company. Those are useful people to have in your network if you want to change. Because if you can get them behind you, you've got a good chunk of your work done. Right? Hierarchy relies on a few sources of power, traditionally. There's coercion, do this or else. There's rewards. If you do this, you'll get a bonus. If you don't do this, bottom of the ranking. Those are I personally don't think those are the most effective ways to get things done, but they are part of the currency of power in most organizations. There's positional power, which says, I'm a manager and I have legitimate authority to tell you to do something, right? So these are currencies of power in organizations. And if you rely strictly on the formal hierarchy, that's what you are left with, right? Get on the bus, or go find a new job. Do this because I'm your manager. The downside, it may appear to be efficient, right? But the downside is that the best you can hope for when you rely on those sources of power is compliance. So, I don't want to get fired, I'll do it. Oh, I want my bonus, I'll do it. Oh, you said to do it, I'll do it. Compliance. Networks rely on expertise or trust for their power. Either you're recognized as an expert, and so from that network, people will tend to buy in because we know that guy knows what he's talking about, or we know that gal knows what she's talking about. So, must not be such a bad idea. Let's give it a try. Or we know that he's a straight shooter and we can trust him. We can trust him on this. We can trust her on this. So if you can figure out who is trusted and who people go to for advice, you might get a lot of benefit for the thing you're trying to change. You may also learn that it's really not such a great idea, and then you can refine what you're doing. You can refine your approach. Right? So you need to pay attention to the networks you can take advantage of, but you need to also be aware of those that you might inadvertently cut off. So my husband works for a consulting engineering firm, and they have a number of different practice areas. So he's in the environmental group, and there's a remediation group, and there's a group that does permitting, and all these different groups. And they pride themselves as a company on providing this broad range of services, so that if they are hired to do one thing and another need comes up, they have the relationships in place that they can say, oh, well, we can address that need. And they were doing it so well that they were growing. They kept getting more work from clients because we trust these people, they do a good job, and they did a good job for us here, and they can help us with this. It was great. They needed more office space, so they got rid of the lunchroom. And what do you think happened? What do you think happened when they got rid of the lunchroom? It took a while for it to show up, but all of those informal conversations where someone from remediation had talked to someone from environmental, and they said, oh yeah, there's a place on this project where you could really be helpful. Or, oh, they're doing this business over here, let me introduce you to the client contact. All of those conversations stopped. And eventually it showed up in lower cross-selling and lower revenue. But there was a long tail on that. So you need to look at the networks for what you can leverage, but also be careful not to destroy a really important network, right? That's essential to some other functioning in your business. They help you diffuse ideas, they create connections, tend to make changes happen much more rapidly in organizations. Now, if you don't really want change, this can be a bad thing, right? If you just want the motions of change, it can be a bad thing. But if you really want to diffuse ideas, this is a really powerful way to do it. Pay attention to networks. Guide the change. Changes need to be guided carefully. We can't know up front everything that will need to happen. We can't anticipate every local condition. So we need to guide it and consider what principles apply, what actually does need to be globally applied, and what can vary on a local basis. We are very attracted to the idea of standardization and efficiency, and it works great in engines. It works great in some manufacturing situations, but it's not always so helpful when you are working with a very complex human system. So it's a trap to try to standardize, and it's a trap to try to make everything perfect at the first attempt. So we need to figure out what actually does need to be uniform everywhere. It's far less than what we generally think. We need things that are coherent, right? We need things to hang together in a coherent way, but we don't need things to be standard. So anybody have any guesses about what those 6 leaves are? Any guesses about what those are? It's my favorite metaphor for this concept. They are all oak leaves, but they're oaks that grow in different conditions. Some of those oaks like dry conditions, some of them like wet conditions, some of them do well in sandy soil. And you have to choose the oak that's going to grow in the environment. You know you need an oak, but the kind of oak depends on the environment you're in. So I find this to be a very useful metaphor to think about when we're making a change. We want an oak, but over here, you need a red oak, and your team needs a pin oak, and you need a bur oak. So think about what flavor or what variation on something will be helpful and create coherence without that false need to standardize everything. Some things you need to standardize. Like I think having the same kind of plug-in socket is sort of helpful, right? You know, of course I'm looking down at my adapter here, because you guys don't have the same kind of plug-in sockets I do. But you know, within a country, that makes a lot of sense, right? You don't have to rewire your house or buy a bunch of adapters. So you have to figure out where those interfaces are, where it actually does need to be identical. And you need to work by successive approximation. So you try something, it's a little off, you try something else, it's a little off, you try it again. So learn as you go. And don't try to have the change be perfect from the outset. It's a trap. Because you don't know what the conditions are going to be in every situation. You don't know what you haven't learned yet. So guide, look for the essence you need, allow for variation. Design experiments to facilitate change. It allows people to learn as they go, and it reduces the gratuitous disruption of many changes. So I find that when most people hear about a big change, they freak out, right? It's an existential threat. Right? We're going to have to change everything we do. Out with the old, in with the new. Everything changes. Everything gets disrupted. And there's a very interesting thing that happens in major disruptions, I have noticed, is that very often, particularly if people haven't looked at what holds the current pattern in place, you get this major disruption, and then everything snaps back into place, but with new names. So I once upon a time worked in a company that was implementing a methodology that shall remain nameless, but it took up this much space on the credenza. There were that many binders. It shall remain nameless. It wasn't an IBM thing. And they had new names for everything. Right? There were work products, and there were job aids, and there were blah, 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 where we had before just had templates and documents. We now had job aids and work products. And this whole thing. And it was like, man, everybody in the company went through sheep dip training. Everybody in the company had to use new language. It's not a template, it's a job, you know, or you get the blame. And this was supposed to solve the problem of projects being late, right? Well, that wasn't the reason projects were late, but millions of dollars on this methodology. And I noticed that the same things, the same patterns were repeating on projects. You know, they were still late and over budget and all these other things. And for a while I thought, this change hasn't worked at all. You know, the manager saying, this is new methodology is now business as usual. I said, what the hell? And then I realized, yes, it is business as usual. We're doing exactly the same things, but calling them different names. This happens in Agile too. You guys have seen that happen. You just have new names. Just have new names for the same old things. So this is what happens when you do these big monolithic changes, right? You get huge disruption. You get people who are feeling an enormous sense of loss. You get people who are freaked out, they're stressed out, and because they're freaked out and stressed out, they're not doing their jobs very well anymore. And then eventually the system often snaps back into place. So experiments short circuit a lot of that. You know, they let people do tiny little changes that don't seem like a threat, right? They don't seem like it's a permanent thing. They may be permanent if they work out, right? But it's a way for people to practice, for people to learn, for people to get their fingerprints on change, which is super important. People always like something better when they've had a chance to influence it, and they've had some say in shaping it. So it's theirs. It's not something that's been imposed on them, right? It's not something that someone's pushing onto them. It's something they participated in. So it helps. Plus, there are a lot of problems that you cannot approach directly. One of my clients had issues with their cycle time. You know, it was quite long. But that's not something you can approach directly. You can't just lop off 3 months of the cycle time. You have to understand what the contributing factors are. And in this case, it took a lot of experiments based on what we were pretty sure was contributing to it to figure out, yeah, this really is making a difference. This isn't making a difference. You know, this is what we need to learn. These are some of the factors that are going on here. So that was the way we made a difference, right? There's no way you can just lop time off, cycle time. You have to experiment, right? When we've done experiments in all sorts of things to move things forward in a small way that actually nudges the system in a better direction rather than causing a huge disruption that lets things snap back. So I typically like to insert at least 3 ideas into an organization when I'm working with change, because then people get a chance to choose, right? They don't like one idea, they choose another one. That's not just an imposition of one thing. I like my little acronym up there of FINE for experiments, which stands for fast feedback, inexpensive, no permission needed, and easy. Do stuff that's easy. You know, there's enough hard stuff in the world. There's enough hard stuff. And we can make change less hard by using these experiments, doing things we don't have to get a huge budget for. We don't need to get sign-off from 32 vice presidents. We don't need to get permission. Get fast feedback, move things forward, nudging things along, working by successive approximation. And eventually you get big changes, right? So in most changes I work with, people are looking for some significant difference. Otherwise they wouldn't be, you know, talking to me, they wouldn't be hiring me or trying to make whatever change this is. And they very often want some big outcome measure. You know, we want to reduce blah, blah, blah by blah, 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 or increase blah, blah, blah by blah, blah, blah. Those measures often take years to achieve, months at the minimum, often years to achieve. So I find it's really important to look for indicators that you can detect. People always want measures. Measures seem big. You know, it seems like a capital M. We need indicators that we can detect. What are the small, subtle signs that we can observe as we do experiments that tell us, we're going in the right direction here. This is moving in a better way. you know, if we do this, we will expect that we might see teams overcommitting less often. You can observe that, you can detect it way before you can detect something about your release time. Yeah, so look for these tiny, subtle ways that you might notice that something is moving in the right direction. Okay, 6 rules. Always come back to congruence. Regain your balance. You will come back to this again and again because change can be super frustrating and super difficult, and you're not immune. As someone who is trying to help another organization make change or make your own organization, you're not immune to that feeling of stress and chaos, right? So come back to this. It's where you can access your best problem solving, your best thinking, and it's where you can access your empathy. Super important. Don't make people wrong. Honor what has been valuable about the past. You know, you can acknowledge it's not working now, but you can also acknowledge that it was valuable at one time, and at one time it made sense, and it was someone's best effort to do something. Be sure to observe your current situation. This will help you choose actions that are most likely to move forward. So you're not just stabbing that poor donkey in the dark, dizzy, hoping, right? Hone your skills for observation and pay attention to what's holding the current pattern in place, because unless you shift that, chances are pretty good not much will change. The pattern may stay locked down in spite of your best efforts. Make use of networks. If you only rely on the hierarchy, you are limiting yourself to certain paths of communication and certain forms of power. And the network can diffuse information much more quickly and with less friction through your organization. Guide your change. Consider what principles need to apply globally and where you need to choose a different kind of oak, right? We know we need an oak. Bur oak, pin oak, red oak. And use experiments. They will nudge the system in a direction. You'll learn more. You'll encounter less resistance. And people will feel like the change is not a threat. So those are the 6 rules for change. And I believe I have some time for questions. Okay, I'm going to show you my next slide, though. This is my neighborhood bear. So, who has a question?
Has anyone ever hit him?
The question is, has anyone ever hit the bear? Not as far as I know, although someone did discover him in their kiddie pool this summer on a hot day for us. You know, it was probably not a hot day for anyone else, but it was a hot day for us, and someone came home and there's this bear in the kiddie pool. They left him alone.
Did you take the photo?
I did.
Is it zoomed in, or is it?
No. Was, you know, there's the length of the hood of my car plus a few feet.
Do you need precondition to apply
Could
your
I-
rules?
Sorry.
Yep.
Do you need precondition to apply your rules?
I would say that my rules are the precondition for change.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of it's kind of opposite. And actually, a lot of these are designed so that you don't need permission to do them. I mean, you don't need permission to you know, try to maintain your balance between considering self, other, and context. You don't need permission to honor what has been useful about the past or to observe what's going on. When it gets to analyzing networks, well, you know, that can take some software to make that happen and maybe some permission to do it. But most of these you don't need. You can just do them. I guess the precondition is that you feel like, I feel balanced enough to do this. Another question? Yeah.
So what happens if there's already the change anti-patterns, like somebody's already trying to do a really big change or stuff like that? What advice can you give in that situation?
Can you tell me a little bit about, give me a little more context?
For example, just on the last point about make small experimental changes, whereas I'm in an organization that's going full-blown safe and trying to fix a specific problem. And I've been through it before, and I know safe is not the silver bullet, but they're already fully committed in this.
Thank you for the added context. So in such a situation, I might look at what is potentially valuable in the change and try to do it in tiny little pieces. Just experiment, because there's some useful stuff about some things, so I better not go into any detail. In almost anything, there's something useful. So if you can find a small thing that will be helpful, or if you can do something that is not contradictory to it, so you get fired, then try moving things in a good direction where you can. Because the reality is that these very big top-down processes, there's lots of room for local adaptation that can fly under the radar. Oh, don't report me on that one. It's on tape. Did that help? Yeah. So it reminds me of another thing I see often is that companies will stack one change on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And it's an interesting phenomena because I swear, do you guys know the expression, bless their heart? Oh, bless their heart. In the US, in the South, some of you guys have already heard these stories. So once you have said bless their hearts, you can say almost anything. Like, bless her heart, she looks as big as a barn in that dress. So bless their hearts. Some executives seem to think that change is a step function, like you're here, and it goes like that. I'm drawing in the air. Change is actually more like we're here, and then some big change happens, and things go like this. Things get erratic, and because people are stressed out and freaked out, and they don't know how to do this new thing, performance tends to get kind of erratic, and it tends to go into a sort of trough where people are all upset about everything. So if an executive who believes that change is a step function comes along and looks into this chaos, oh my God, it's not working. We must try something else. And so then they bring in another big change. And it perpetuates and increases the amount of time that the organization spends in chaos. It makes it almost impossible to make progress. I did some consulting at one company who had it as an article of faith that they had to do a reorg every 6 months so that people didn't get too comfortable. Well, nobody was ever comfortable enough to get any work done. So then they'd have to do another reorg because, clearly people weren't able to get their work done because they weren't organized correctly. So so you can actually keep an organization in perpetual chaos by doing a series of big changes. Why you would want to, I don't know, but it happens. Who has the next question?
How cool's this? You've used a lot of metaphors in the presentation.
Yes, I do.
And I'm also a big fan of metaphors. I wondered how much metaphor work you do with your clients, and if so, what tools do you use to kind of help them come up with their metaphors?
Well, we are all swimming in metaphor all the time. We are awash in a sea of metaphor. How many of you counted how many metaphors I just used?
It's at least 20.
Yes. Metaphor, we have this idea that it's flowery, poetic language, but it's actually the basis of our cognition. Mm-hmm. That our minds are actually wired in such a way that, whatever, metaphor we hear kicks off a set of frames in our brain. And within those frames, there are characters that play parts, and only certain parts can be played, and that limits the action. So metaphor certainly can open up a certain avenue of thought, but it closes down many others. So I do pay attention to the metaphors that people use, and I will often introduce a different metaphor. So, for example, one company I worked with, it was a startup. The founder was still very active. He still is very active. But the metaphor they used for their company was, we're like a family. We are like a family. And one of the side effects of that was that they couldn't let anybody go. Because you can't fire a family member. Right, you can't kick out a family member. They had some people who weren't doing their jobs. They had someone who was, running a side business out of accounting. So that was a metaphor they had that was really limiting them. And when they did finally, have to fire the person who was running the side business, it was like this enormous trauma, right? So it's useful to help people explore their metaphors. What is this making possible? What is this making impossible or difficult for us? And they stopped using that metaphor, right? In that case, we didn't replace it. We just talked more accurately about what was going on. This metaphor is experiencing one thing as another, right? So we just used more accurate language.
Do you use much clean language?
No. No, that comes out of a therapeutic background. And I tend not to go there. I know that many people are quite big on it right now. Yeah. I do find George Lakoff's work quite interesting. Although his work was done before a lot of the most recent neuroscience research was done.
Who did you say?
George Lakoff. He did a very dense book called Metaphors We Live By, which talks about the embodied nature of metaphor. We talk about someone being a warm person. Does that metaphor sound familiar? Oh, she's a very warm person. And that actually comes from the embodied action of holding a small child close to you. That's where the warm comes from. There's a lot of things about, up is generally considered better, higher is generally considered better. They're all embodied physical metaphors. Really interesting work. Yes?
Hi. You spoke about the fine experiments, fast feedback, and no permission needed, easy. Mm-hmm. And you offered 3 ideas for experiments. So I wondered, how much clarity do you have about your end state when you're working in this smaller experimental way?
Well, I don't think of experiments in organizational settings as a purely scientific experiment. I generally have some hypothesis of where I think things are going to go. I find that having a very explicit idea of how I want this to turn out can blind me to some very interesting, unintended, beneficial consequences, right? So I have a rationale. I have some idea about what I want to learn. I may have a hypothesis about where I think things are going to go, but I try not to over-specify.
So at the larger scale, how often are your customers surprised about the direction that everything went
Sometimes, but not always in a negative way. So, so years ago, I was involved in an experiment where it was done in a fairly experimental way, where the senior managers decided they wanted people to be more empowered. How many of you have heard that before? Want people to be empowered. So, so there were a number of small things that happened over the period of time, and one of the senior managers sent out a memo that was counterproductive, shall we say. And one of the people who was like, not even in a management job, so, a team member, felt empowered to go tell him what was wrong with the memo. And he was very surprised at that, because he had hoped people would be empowered to do what he wanted them to do. And he got something else. And when he was asked about it, he said, oh yeah, that's okay. I was surprised. I didn't think that's what would happen, but it was actually sort of useful. Right? And not every manager would respond that way. I mean, so he actually, that was sort of interesting that he said, oh, wow, this is really different than I thought empowerment was going to be. People feel like they can tell me when I'm doing something really silly. That's super useful. But yeah, sometimes people are surprised.
So to clarify, you don't like to have a full hypothesis for your experiments because you feel it might limit the unexpected results of the experiment?
I feel it might blind me to beneficial unanticipated results. If I'm like very focused on this, I may not notice this wonderful thing happening over here, right? Because in complex systems, everything touches everything. And so you change one thing and it moves something over here.
And do you have multiple experiments going on at the same time?
Sorry, I forgot to repeat your first question. So my response was to the question, do I always not specify my hypothesis? Yeah. So, and the second question was, do I have multiple experiments going on? Yeah. Usually. I mean, we're not talking about a lab here where we can control for everything, right? And we're talking about, entangled multiple causality. So, sometimes things change differently than I think they will. But if your experiments are small, you can recover quickly if it's going off the rails.
Yeah, but if you have multiple small experiments, is that any better than having one big experiment?
Yeah. What did you think I'd say? So the question was, if you have multiple small experiments, is that any better than having one big experiment? Yeah, because they're all more limited in scope, and I'm learning as I go, right? And if something goes, if one of my 5 experiments goes off the rails, I recover from that when I shut it down. It's not like, oh, I'm going to do this big thing. It's like changing it in an agile way, right? You don't try to get it right up front, right? At least I don't. I try to know what direction I want to go in and nudge the system that way. And it sounds like it'll take longer, doesn't it? Sounds like it'll take a really long time working in small experiments. But if you think about it, most of these changes that get dropped through the ceiling from the Elysium onto the heads of everyone else, here's the announcement here in time. And way over here, it maybe looks like you can declare success for some definition of success. Because all along here, people have been like responding in, what some people call resistance. They've been responding, they've been defending, they've been moving against it. So there's this long period of time. The announcements is short, but the actual Change may or may not happen for a long time. But if you're making small little experiments, you know, you might be a little off track, but then you get back on. You know, so does it take longer? You know, I don't think it necessarily does.
Yeah, I was more concerned about doing them all at the same time and how that could, if we use another metaphor of several plates spinning at the same time, or one big plate, and from me in an organisation who's scared about change and what might happen, which one's going to be scarier for me? Probably the several little plates.
Well, so there's another question about metaphor. So is it better to have several little plates spinning or one big plate spinning? And of course, that reminded me of the time I was hit in the back of the head with a burrito in the Mission District. And I was lucky because I didn't get hit by the plate. This person who had some mental issues came into this burrito joint, and you know, something upset her, and she threw the plate at the cooks, and the burrito hit me in the back of the head. So when I think about plates, that's what your metaphor kicked off for me, and I'm glad it was a small plate. I'm really glad that was a small plate. You know, if someone's going to be hit by a plate, I want it to be a tiny plate, a small plate, not the, you know, we just had Thanksgiving in the U.S., not the turkey platter that's this big. Another question.
Yeah, just a quick question from me. One of the things that can happen is you've got a company inertia to change. And within that, there is you used the word deterministic earlier on. Deterministic versus organic is a big thing for me. And I think the experimentation allows for organic appreciation of where you need to get to and where you need to be. Quite often we find that people are much more deterministic. They're saying, we're going to go here, and if we're not here, it's not successful. What techniques are there to instill to say actually organic and unknown is okay, rather than the deterministic is always the answer?
Oh, it's a hard one because we've got a long legacy of thinking about organizations as mechanisms, right? I mean, that is the dominant metaphor of how people think about organizations. They're big, vast machines. Well-oiled machines, and we are, you know, all but cogs. So it's a tough one. And I try to do little experiments to say, well, it's okay, and to show people. I find showing is often more effective than trying to convince people it's okay. You know, and then sometimes I bring in examples from real life, because I find that a lot of people know all sorts of stuff in their personal lives that they forget when they walk into, this model of a mechanistic system. They think about it as if it's a mechanism. So I might talk about, well, do we always know the outcome of a sports game? No, we don't know. We may have some guesses based on, you know, who's on the team and what the record is and so forth, but we don't know exactly how those plays are going to play out, right? Sometimes they work great, sometimes they don't. So sometimes I try to bring in those sorts of examples from real life that people don't live mechanistically, right? They live in their real life planning in a very, contingent sort of way. I mean, you guys know Dave Snowden? You know, he uses the example of a kid's birthday party, right? Nobody plans a kid's birthday party in a deterministic way, right? You set some broad parameters, you create certain conditions, and then you see what happens, right? And you get out the fire hose to clean up afterwards. But so people do this sort of planning all the time in their real lives. And how many folks in this room are married, have been married, or know someone who's married? I think I got everyone covered. So That's a big commitment. That's a big change to take on in your life. None of us know how it's going to work out. We do it anyway. How was I to know that my husband had no idea how to do laundry? I have no idea. I found out. Now I thought of another story, which I probably shouldn't tell you. Okay, I've got a million stories. Was that helpful? You know, try to bring in other examples from real life.
Yeah, I just said I think the company inertia sometimes. I think the elastic band that drags people back is sometimes very, very strong, and especially I think some of the innovation that these techniques have got is a struggle for some people.
Sure, and that's one of the reasons I look at what's holding the pattern in place, because that is part of that rubber band. Are you going to send up the hook for me now?
No.
Oh, okay.
I know there are 2 more people with questions.
Oh, okay.
If you're okay to do that.
I'm okay. The jet lag has not kicked in yet, so I'm good. I don't know what will happen when it does, but.
Speaking about things that hold current patterns in place, I have a situation where it was a top-down decision to do the change, but it's the leadership that are the things that hold the patterns in place. And while we're trying to do small experiments and things, the leadership will often come in and just ruin everything. How do I broach that subject specifically? I'm not the person. We have an Agile coach, and I'm just a Scrum Master in the organization, so I don't have the pull to. I'm a Scrum Master in an organization. I don't have the pull currently to approach leadership, so I'm not sure how to broach that subject with them because they're ruining our experiments and actually demoralizing the team.
Sure. So what would happen if you did talk to a manager about it?
At the moment, it would help for about a week or 2, and then it would go back to the way it was.
So it might be worth talking to them to see if it will help for a week or 2, and talk to them about, you know, there's some patterns I'm seeing. And I think these are the things that might be contributing to that pattern. Now, I know you want this particular outcome, this particular result that we're hoping for, and I need some help with these patterns, right? And you know, one of the ironies of change is that it's almost always those people over there who need to, those people, you know. So I think it's reasonable for the managers to have their own change backlog, and sometimes when I can. And I'm in a little different position than you are, but there's a practice called TRIZ. You guys know about liberating structures? I know at least one of you does. They have an app. There's an app for liberating structures, which you can download at the iTunes at the App Store. But one of the things they described is called TRIZ. And it's an interesting exercise that I do with a lot of management teams. It says, you know, well, we want this wonderful outcome over here. We want this wonderful outcome. And so then I ask them, well, what could you do to really screw it up? And much hilarity ensues, and they think about all of this silly things they could do that would really make a mess of it. And then I ask them, you know, are we doing anything that in any way remotely resembles any of those things? And then they decide to do some changes. Now, I don't know if you feel comfortable doing that, or maybe you could talk to the Agile coach about it, and, you know, yeah, because they need to, you know, if you're going to make that sort of change in your organization, if you want your organization to be Agile, then managers have to change too. And there's a far more strategic role for them in most cases. Who has the cube? Mhm.
I want to ask you about what's your approach when you're being asked such questions? How do you prove that the change happened?
So the question is, how do you, measurement comes up, and how do you prove that a change is is worth the investment you're putting in with it? I am fond of a technique called subjective impact analysis, which I learned from a former IBM guy named Jerry Weinberg, which is a way of doing an approximation of impact. So sometimes I use that. Sometimes I look at, what are the indicators that we can find that things are moving in a better direction, and try to steer away from these big outcome measurements. People have gotten into a habit of asking for these elaborate financial justifications for projects, but most of them are fiction. It's fiction writing. I've done those net present value spreadsheets. You just plug in numbers till it looks like you want it to look. And so I try to refocus about, what's the cost of not doing anything? What's the potential benefit of the changes? Here are some indicators that we're moving in the right direction. And it's not unreasonable to want to know that something's making a difference. It's just, I think the big outcome measures usually take too long for people to get any sense that you're actually making progress. So the subjective impact can help with that. There's not a perfect answer to it, though.
Okay. Oh. Hello?
Have we lost our mic?
Once before requested that my microphone was turned on in a slightly different way to the way I just did, and I'm not going to make that mistake again, because really, really loudly shouted across the room, could somebody please turn me on? Yeah, I went very red.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now we're both going to turn red.
Thank you very, very much indeed.
It was my pleasure.
That was fantastic. It's given me personally a huge amount of food for thought and some specific ideas and things, and I was frantically writing notes about things I'm going to do when I get back to the day job. So thank you very much. We have a little we have a little something.
Oh, thank you.
To enjoy.
Oh my, how lovely.
Could we have a round of applause for us?
Oh, thank you. So this topic is near and dear to my heart, as you might guess. So if you have questions that come up about this, because the devil's always in the details. That's how to get hold of me. I have a phone and I know how to use it, but given the time lag, email might work better. So yeah. Thanks. And thank you.